So you've spent more than a decade in this space, and there's, in our pre-interview, one number that seems to follow you everywhere, and it's the 25 to 30% waste, right? What is the 25 to 30% waste number, and why do you think that number never seems to move?
Yeah. There's a slide that we use that effectively shows research for the last 10 years, since we really started talking about software asset management before it went into ITAM and FinOps, and almost every single one references 25 to about 30% of waste. Sometimes it's in a particular category, like SaaS, sometimes just all up technology. I think the first thing to acknowledge is it's very difficult to do. So there are certain things that are within our control and there are certain things that aren't. The challenge is every time we make a recommendation, there is a knock-on effect. I could say there are 100 Oracle databases that you could remove, they're not being leveraged. But unless you have the right stakeholders in place who understand the actual consequence or the other application dependencies tied to those databases, it's very unlikely they're going to turn it off. So that's what we reference with the Rubik's Cube. It's every time you want to make a decision, you have to understand all of those dependencies.
In the world of technology, heroes are everywhere. They're overcoming disruption, delivering sustainable outcomes, and fearlessly forging the future to solve what's next. Join me, Ed McNamara, as we meet the people and businesses driving change in our constantly disruptive world. This is Innovation Heroes, a podcast brought to you by SHI. For years, IT leaders have lived with a number that seems almost cursed, 30%. 30% of cloud spend is wasted. 30% of SaaS licenses sit unused. 30% of software budgets are misaligned with actual business needs. It shows up in every report, every benchmark, every annual forecast, and it never changes. Meanwhile, something else is happening. Budgets are flat, cloud costs keep rising, and AI is suddenly demanding a double-digit share of IT investment in both time and money. And the old hope that someone, somewhere, could just own this mess has collapsed under the weight of reality. But as Jason Bateman once said in a movie, it's not a problem unless you have a solution. Today's guest has been staring at this problem from every angle for more than a decade. He thinks organizations are asking the wrong question. Instead of asking how to cut costs, he thinks they should be asking how to provide value. Because when you can provide ROI, the budget conversation completely changes. Shane Cronin leads ITAM and FinOps Services at SHI. His team is helping enterprises rethink what technology governance actually means in our new AI-driven world. Shane, welcome to Innovation Heroes.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So before we get into the state of technology spend, let's start simple. When someone outside our industry asks what you actually do, you're at that proverbial, cocktail party. How do you explain ITAM and FinOps in a way that makes sense?
I would say for us, it's three things that we do, almost in stages. So the first is we help organizations gain clarity and control. So what do I own? What have I deployed? How am I leveraging it? All those. From once you've established that, you can make better decisions. So the second thing is we help organizations make better decisions based on that data. And the third, probably the most tricky bit, is how do we actually realize the value of that technology? And that's primarily what we do.
Got it. So, and how do you do that? What's at your disposal? What kind of expertise? What kind of tools? Or is that its own podcast in and of itself?
It's probably its own podcast, but it's a great question. I mean, fundamentally, what it is a very strong team who have deep expertise across multiple areas. Most of my org is obviously on the compliance side of things and the financial side of things. How are things licensed? How is technology consumed? But underlying all of that is a set of technologies. So something like a Flexera or a ServiceNow, Apptio, Cloud Health, that gives us that consumption data that we can do work on. You merge those two things together and you kind of get clarity and control. Yeah. It's a moving target, but those are the two primary tools at disposal.
You've probably encountered customers who either think they can do this themselves or have tried to do this themselves. Why can't they?
So the first thing is it's really hard. So, you think of it, the last 12 months with Microsoft alone, okay? They've changed their contractual models. They've changed the partner programs, which means that your typical support environment has changed. They've re-leveled pricing, then they've increased pricing in other areas. They've released AI solutions. That's one thing that a company is probably buying, right? You have hundreds more likely. No organization is able to hire an expert on Oracle, SAP, VMware, Adobe, right? You have to go to the community because it is complicated. The rules change all the time. It's a moving target, and you're not entirely in control of that. So I would say very mature organizations have good clarity. I would say not many organizations have moved towards that realizing of value. That's
Right.
where a lot of the fall down is.
Right. So you've spent more than a decade in this space. One number that seems to follow you everywhere, and it's the 25 to 30% waste, right? Like, why do you think what is the 25 to 30% waste number, and why do you think that number never seems to move?
Yeah. So we've been talking, so there's a slide that we use that effectively shows research for the last 10 years, since we really started talking about software asset management before it went into ITAM and FinOps. And almost every single one references 25 to about 30% of waste. Sometimes it's in a particular category like SaaS, sometimes it's just all up technology.
Right.
I think the first thing to acknowledge is it's very difficult to do. So there are certain things that are within our control and there are certain things that aren't. I just referenced all the change that happens that's outside of our control. And sometimes organizations have to react to that. No person who's trying to help manage technology spend predicted the influx of demand for AI.
Right.
Suddenly you got to figure out, like, how am I going to measure this? Have I got tools that can even measure the deployment of this? And then the licensing rules are changing. So it's really hard. What's in our control, though, is how we approach that and thinking about it beyond, okay, we got an audit. How do we deal with that? Oh, we got this audit. We got this renewal. We really have to move beyond that reactive approach and start thinking more about, like, how are we managing it as a technology? How are we managing technology as a whole? What are the processes we have in place so that we have the right procedures and communication in place that when things pivot, we're able to work better together?
And you mentioned audits. Like, I think we're 4 minutes in and we got to the word audit, but audit just reminds me of a line for Office Space where it's like, if people only work to not get fired, they'll do just the right amount that they can do for that not to happen. Like, if you're just managing this like for an audit, like, people will do like whatever they can do to satisfy an audit. They're not really optimizing.
Yes, right? So most organizations are actually taking it in a way of like, will I pass the test?
Right.
Not really, am I optimizing this in the most appropriate way? We know the most common auditors, they're generally tied to the biggest amount of spend that you have. And I think Flexera referenced in their State of the ITAM report, a third of organizations had reported an audit where the bill was bigger than $1 million.
Yeah.
So it's still persistent. It still happens. And I guess we still get caught red-handed.
Right. But an audit's that's not working to proactively optimize anything.
Yeah.
That's just to avoid a fine and the embarrassment.
100%. Yeah, it's your personal reputation.
So, like, can you give us like a concrete example of when an organization tries to fix one problem and something else breaks? Like, what does that look like in real life?
The primary thing that we see is broken silos and broken processes when managing technology. So if you take an example, I could implement Clarity all day long by leveraging world-class platform and aligning my set of capabilities that exist in my team to a customer. But at the end of the day, if we're not able to take action on those things, then it's just a fancy report that's telling you you're overspending or underspending or you got compliance risk or not. The challenge is every time we make a recommendation, there is a knock-on effect. I could say there are 100 Oracle databases that you could remove. They're not being leveraged. But unless you have the right stakeholders in place who understand the actual consequence or the other application dependencies tied to those databases, it's very unlikely they're going to turn it off. So that's what we reference with the Rubik's Cube. It's every time you want to make a decision, you have to understand all of those dependencies. And that's generally the thing that prohibits action, is a lack of understanding about what those dependencies are and the right change management with those stakeholders to make it happen.
Got it. And I mean, when you mentioned stakeholders, so that kind of brings to mind, are organizations, are they even, from a structural standpoint, are they, they're getting their marching orders from up the line who has no understanding of what they're even asking you to do, right? Like, they're like, here's what we want to see happen, but they're not, they don't, I guess maybe some of those stakeholders and maybe the C-suite it's almost like it would be better if it went back up the chain and the people who are tasked with this are like, well, here's what you asked for, but here's what we could actually do.
Yeah. That is one of the primary things that we do see is generally there is a disconnect between ITAM in particular, or even FinOps. FinOps is kind of owned in the engineering world. A lot of engineers leverage those best practices. ITAM is often its own function, but quite disconnected from the executive level.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes we're not connecting, like, what is the business objectives that we're actually that we should be tying to and communicating in that language up the chain so that it's, one, easy for the CIO or CFO to understand.
Right.
But then also we get a lot of requests vice versa, where a CIO will say, we spend all this money on the Microsoft stack. We should be leveraging the Microsoft stack and, rationalizing all our applications. But in practicality, doing that has a lot of negative consequences for the user groups who are maybe using those various SaaS applications that they need. And the breakdown happens in the middle. So it's how do you connect the executives plus the people in the ground that are doing the work to understand like what decisions can be made to make a positive impact for the business?
Has AI changed the conversation at all? Because when we talk about like C-level and then like what C-level is asking of their business and IT leaders, it sounds like, that AI has caused the C-suite to say, hey, I want to know the story of what we're doing with AI. I'm reading all these things and seeing all this potential. What is our story so that I can go to the board or I can go to the stakeholders? Like, what's our story? It feels like they never asked that question about like ITAM.
No, and that's the funny thing that's changing in the market. So it depends on who you ask, really. So if we look at certain analyst community, like Gartner's kind of focus more that there is still a demand for optimizing AI spend, that organizations feel like AI is out of control and we need to rein in the spending. You talk a little bit more to, let's say, the FinOps community, and there's a belief that what CIOs really want to demonstrate is the value of what they're spending. They're not so much saying, hey, I want to stop spending that. It's like, I want to prove that that is worthwhile. Am I getting X result for that thing? One, I think AI has accelerated that dialogue across the technology stack. The FinOps Foundation in particular is starting to lean more into managing data center spend, where before it was maybe exclusively on cloud. It's a little bit more forward thinking in how to manage AI spend. And as a result, that's changing some mindsets in the market as like, are we thinking about this the right way? Mm-hmm. Like, are we this constant fear of audits and are we spending too much? Should we be more thinking about like, is what we're spending on giving us the value that we expected from it? So I think that's one thing. And I think the second thing is just the pressure it's putting on the people who work in ITAM or FinOps is prior to AI, I think it's there was cloud and that had smoothed out a little bit in terms of like pressure to do it. Now the pressure's coming, so like you have to move quickly. So you're trying to navigate all the old stuff plus all the new stuff at the same time. And that's quite difficult.
So it might be a good time to just clarify what you mean by like ITAM and FinOps, right? Like, how do you differentiate between the two?
I'll get in trouble. So like, okay, so ITAM has been here for like 10, 15 years.
Right.
And ITAM is effectively grounded in licensing, right? It's the traditional, I have a data center and SQL licensing is complex. I'm running tooling to understand how I'm leveraging it. I'm understanding what use rights I have and making sure I don't go out of bounds or inbounds or I guess that's a bad analogy, but I don't go out of bounds with my spending. Mm-hmm. With the emergence of cloud, the FinOps Foundation sort of began. And the FinOps Foundation, I think to some extent, witnessed a challenge that ITAM had, which ITAM was seen as the police, right? Like if somebody felt ITAM was coming for them within an organization, it was like probably going to tell you to stop deploying so many databases or applications.
Right.
When it came to cloud and the fact that you were able to spin up workloads so quickly and innovate so quickly, what FinOps started to focus much more on was like, how does everybody take ownership for what they're deploying? How do we build a culture of accountability? How do we continue to enable innovation without prohibiting people from making those fast decisions? So over time, those two things have almost gone in separate ways. You had ITAM managing, let's say, traditional licensing and data center and on-prem technology, FinOps doing cloud. What you've now seen is a little bit of a merging of the two. FinOps is talking a lot more about using FinOps principles to manage the data center. ITAM starts talking about things like SaaS and cloud. Somewhere they're meshing. At the end of the day, they are best practices for managing technology. And one is better fit for one type of technology, the other is better for the other. So organizations just have to, pull from the best practices that are best for them.
You said something in the prep call that kind of stuck with our producers about handing a CIO a report showing millions in potential savings and then nothing happens after that. How often does something like that happen? Because it's given lip service, and you're like, here's the report, and then changes aren't made.
It happens super frequently. I mean, we track and the 30%, right?
Mm-hmm.
If there were best practices implemented, and at the root of things, we were implementing the governance models that meant that change was acted on based on the data that we were finding, the 30%, I would argue, wouldn't be what it is. And the reason is because we are providing these reports without the understanding of who are the stakeholders that need to be informed or consulted if we were to make this change? Do they have a seat at the table? What is our change management processes? So as a result, we tend to pick the low-hanging fruit very quickly. And then as time progresses, you'll still see these big obstacles in the way, not obstacles, big opportunities for savings in the way that we're not executing on. And that is because we're still living in I would say, a fairly reactive world, right? Those statistics would not exist to the extent that they do if we were making these changes as quickly as we could.
The entire concept of sales, from the beginning of time, is that people will do what they're incented to do.
Yeah.
And why doesn't that translate down to what we're talking about now?
It's so interesting. And, that's another thing FinOps did really well is FinOps will even have best practices for gamification.
Mm-hmm.
So they will gamify the practice of FinOps within not FinOps won't do that, but FinOps practitioners will do that to have leaderboards and have people actually demonstrating the ROI that they're deriving from taking ownership of their technology. So it sounds like a cliche, but most research you will say out there, or even, other parties will say that, it's all these organizations are transforming, but very few have really transformed to the level where they can make those snap decisions.
Mm-hmm.
They see the data, they know who they need to talk to, and they make a decision and it gets executed with speed. Most are still reactive. The majority are.
Got it. And let's face it, I'll use the word adversaries on the other side, on the vendor side, who are not incented in that way.
No, it's the opposite, right? And it's funny because you think about it, we talk about 30%, I didn't reference it before, but tooling has gotten better, professional services have gotten better, and we're still saying the 30%. It's that there is profit to be made by constantly changing the rules. And nobody is changing the rules because it is going to bring down their revenues, right? They are changing the rules because it's going to make it more profitable or optimal, right? All the tweaking of licensing right now to figure out how we do AI, are we going to do it per user, token based? Are we going to do consumption based? We're going to go whichever one makes us the most money. Right. And that causes a negative impact for the customers. That's pretty blunt and probably will, not be a fun message for the partner community, but it's the truth, right? We're here to make a profit.
It is. And I mean, and we're, as most of us own shares through our 401k and all those partners, we kind of want it that way. We're all part of it. We can't act like we're not.
Right. So tackle it head on. Let's figure this out.
So, you did mention AI, which we will a bunch. So we'll talk about that. A recent MIT study found that 95% of enterprise AI pilots are delivering zero measurable ROI. At the same time, Gartner says global AI spending will hit 1.5 trillion this year. How does this disconnect from the 1 trillion spent, 95% of AI pilots, zero measurable ROI? How does this disconnect affect IT leaders who are struggling with this? And is it, at least in the beginning, it seems like it's the best storyteller up the chain is doing really well. But how do you view that disconnect?
To compound that, I think actually, if I'm right, last year was predicted to be 5.7 trillion total global IT spending. So that's a pretty big chunk that AI has taken out. But the interesting thing is that was around 9% growth. At the same time, there was a Gartner study that said that most global enterprises are expecting flat budgets for IT spending next year, and small organizations, SMB, were 2.3% growth. So those two things don't make sense, right? We're expecting all this growth driven by AI, but apparently we have no money to spend it on, or no more money to spend it on. Right. So to answer your question, it's driven by exactly what you said. There is a brand identity, there is a story you can tell in the market by delivering AI. And fundamentally, I think there is a belief that if you were able to operationalize AI properly, you would be able to reduce your OpEx, or you would be able to increase, bad idea if you reduce, but increase your revenues.
Right.
So I do think that is where the There's two sides to this, and I think where we'll see. One is I do think that there will be more urgency into how we can cut costs out of the business.
Mm-hmm.
Because that is the only way that most organizations are going to fund these initiatives, right? So if we have 30% waste, can we get 10% of it in the next 12 months? Not because we're going to take it out of our bottom line, but because we're going to invest it in AI or whatever technology is a priority. Similarly, though, to your point, to then do that isn't going to be good enough. Somebody somewhere is going to have to justify that I spent that $1. Did I get 3 back? Did I get 4? Did I make certain processes more efficient? And that's where I see this 12 to 18 months, there will be a prioritization of figuring out the right mechanisms to calculate that ROI. Because most of the time, I mean, look, I have a budget, but I'm sure if I told our CEO that I would get $10 back for every $1 I spent and I could keep proving it, I could spend more than what's in my budget.
Right.
So I think that's the two areas that will have to happen is saving money, but then also figuring out how to return the investment.
And that's what you've said that, if a CIO can prove the ROI of an investment, like nobody cares about the budget, right? Like
sounds simple. Sorry, you're going to tell me.
I was going to say it sounds almost too simple, but how do they make that argument stick?
Yeah, I think it's all in the data. First of all, maybe a controversial statement as somebody who works as part of many, boards and forums is like, no one's really figured out how to calculate ROI. You referenced the MIT study. How much of that is actually down to the fact that you can't measure it or you haven't figured out how to measure it? Not that you're not getting the ROI. And there was I think Forbes had a study where it said 1%, but they said it was a 10% increase in revenue or 10% decrease in OpEx. So you have all these statistics that are saying that we're not getting the ROI, but I do think fundamentally it's actually the ability to, not so much the lack of ROI in it. So I think the way we make it stick is by figuring out how to calculate the ROI. Because at the end of the day, if we can back it with data, with the right systems, the right processes, the right data that you can then present wherever that might be internally, I think generally that is something that is understood. Right now, we're not doing it.
So we've been talking a lot about AI. We started talking about your team's expertise in it. So what role is AI playing in solving all of this? I mean, are your teams, as terrified as the rest of the world seems to be?
They shouldn't be.
Yeah. And why not?
Yeah. So it would be foolish to say that AI has no place in the ITAM or FinOps world. Right. Look, at the end of the day, let's be really honest about it. When we talk about gaining clarity and control for the most part in those 3 things I said we do, a lot of that is, we have clients who will literally send us PDFs of their purchases for the last 15 years. And sometimes that's our teams who have to go through the effort of extracting the right data to then normalize it, put it into a system of record like a ServiceNow or a Flexera, but then configure that system to the custom rights that customer may have or whatever. That is a lot of manual data work. There is no doubt that we will AI that, right? There's no reason not to. We have to train the models. You've got decades of years of licensing rules and custom use rights and all these things. But fundamentally, I'm sure it will figure it out. I think the advantage to that most of the skill sets of the people who are doing that type of work is actually more advising organizations on like, what do you do with that? So it's telling you all of this consumption data that you have, but what are you supposed to do now? Also, the predictability. So like one of the things that attracted me to SHI is our partner community. Like we are super integrated into the partner community. So you also have to have foresight into what's happening, right? AI systems might not have that. So to your point, we will be very much leveraging AI to accelerate how we can get that time to value for our clients. But then more importantly, we need to pivot our clients that once we remove that work, it's like, let's really think about transformation. Like, how do we implement the right change management processes, the right governance models, so that once the data is represented, you're actually executing against those recommendations and driving the 30% below what it needs to be.
Yeah. And I think that just the language alone, I mean, I've seen some of these. I a million years ago worked in the Microsoft licensing department. And I'm like, how would AI figure out these changing entitlements and not hallucinate and just kick out garbage, right? Somebody's got to be checking this because you could be making, huge monetary decisions on what the outcome is.
Unbelievable. And Now I'm going down rabbit holes, but it's in the news right now where like Allstate and VMware are likely going to court. And I think that MSA was signed in 2008.
Yeah.
So it's not just the changing rules. It's that like this one purchase you might have done, like this one purchase is governed by this contract, which was in this year, and this one is governed by this, right? So you're actually keeping track of the timelines as well as the... So anyway,
I always envision the guy who signed that contract, 10 years retired, being like, seeing the news, being like, I remember that.
Yeah, right. I was a sales guy.
I wonder how those guys are dealing with that now. So how does SHI approach this differently? When an organization comes to you with that 30% problem, or any of the others that we've talked to, what does our engagement look like?
So the first thing that we've done, particularly over the last 8 to 9 months, is what we've really focused on is leaning into how do we enhance our offerings to make sure that we can educate our clients and give them a realistic view of what needs to be fixed in order to drive success. Mm-hmm. So we have, I won't go into them in detail, but we effectively take the best principles from TBM, ITAM, and FinOps, and we created a consistent set of domains. Those domains effectively highlight to a customer what success looks like. So even if a client comes to us and it's a one-time engagement, let's say they need help with Microsoft, chances are if they need help, something's wrong somewhere, right? Yeah. And what we do as part of the engagement, we won't just help solve the Microsoft problem, but we will actually invest in the client and help them identify where across those domains they've got challenges, or where might they not have maturity or they need to be thinking about investing. So what we effectively give them is a roadmap that they can effectively a journey they can go on so that they can fix the problem once and for all. The interesting thing that attracted me here was obviously the sheer partner community we have and the insights that we have. But what's really cool is we're enabling that all through AI. So a lot of the work we've done through our AI labs, I think you've had Jack here.
Yep.
We've been working with him really diligently on how do we leverage all of these capabilities, not just to increase the time to value of our offerings, but actually be able to also advise our customers on an emerging technology that they're struggling with. So I think those are the kind of approaches that we have a bit of a luxury to invest in that some of our competitors don't.
Business leaders, CIOs, right now, flat budgets, pressure to show, return on ROI on AI, but there's so many acronyms I can't keep them straight.
I threw TBM in at you as well at the end, just to keep
I just ignored that one.
I saw your eyes glaze over it. You were like, I'm not getting into it.
I can't do another one. I shouldn't use the word start because nobody really starts this, you know. But like if you know that there's a problem or you're trying to right the ship, whether you're at a company that you're new there and you're just like kind of getting started with like, where do you start in this kind of thing?
Yeah. We effectively start with an assessment. Like we're always happy to lean in and help organizations get data to understand like what's potentially wrong here, or what are the areas or the levers that I have at my disposal to drive quick ROI. So effectively, we work across those 7 domains I mentioned. So generally, it starts as a dialogue with the customer, understanding what they're trying to solve for. We effectively do some due diligence with them to understand across those domains where they have capabilities, where they might have the right tooling or the right processes and people. And then we frame out like what a good ROI would look like. So if they were to make certain decisions, what could you anticipate the ROI of making that investment being? Generally, that gives our CIOs a pretty good understanding of like what the art of the possible is. Sometimes the juice is worth the squeeze more with others, right? And we're very honest about that. If you've committed to certain things with your partners that you can't change for 3 to 5 years, then unfortunately, there's other dynamic. We have to figure out other priorities to focus on. So I think an honest assessment is always where we start, and that's something that we just do with our clients.
And if you're out there and you're an SHI client or hope to be after hearing this, how do they find you, Shane? How do they find you in the team?
Just email me, Shane_Cronin@shi.com, and it would be a great thing if I get hundreds of emails after this.
Amazing. So maybe that 30% waste isn't a failure. Maybe it's a signal that technology has outpaced governance, that our tools and teams were never designed for a world where AI evolves every few weeks, and that the old model, focused on cutting costs instead of providing value, was just too negative. What Shane makes clear is that the future isn't about policing spend. It's about providing value. It's about building a model where ITAM and FinOps work together, not just as enforcers, but as enablers, where the goal isn't a great report that nobody acts on, but actual alignment that moves the needle. And maybe the most important takeaway, if you can prove the ROI, nobody cares about the budget. The question is whether your organization is built to prove it. Shane, thanks for helping us see the big picture. And to our listeners, if the numbers in your organization aren't moving, maybe the problem isn't the spend, maybe it's the model.